The silence in the room wasn't peaceful. It was the thick, suffocating kind that settled after an earthquake, where you're waiting for the next tremor, for the walls to groan and the floor to heave again. I stared at the half-empty teacup, the lukewarm liquid mirroring the state of my enthusiasm, or rather the profound lack thereof. Across the polished mahogany table, my father, Admiral Thompson, was pontificating, his voice resonating with that peculiar blend of authority and self-importance that always managed to make my teeth ache, a low, grinding sensation that spoke of suppressed irritation. He was recounting, for what felt like the 100th time, the story of his diplomatic mission to a small, rather obscure Eastern European country. The punchline, as always, hinged on him, the formidable Admiral, being utterly baffled by a translator who insisted on rephrasing his every pronouncement with an unnerving literalness. Couldn't understand a word the man was saying, really? He'd boom, punctuating it with a hearty, dismissive laugh that never failed to land like a lead weight in my stomach, a heavy leaden thing that sank deep into my gut. He'd always called it his translator joke. A silly anecdote about a cultural misunderstanding, a minor inconvenience that he, the brilliant Admiral, had ultimately navigated with his usual panache. But for me it was a thinly veiled jab, a barb aimed not just at the situation, but at the very essence of my mother. My mother, God rest her soul, had been that translator. She'd been a scholar, a linguist, her mind a vibrant tapestry woven with words and their infinite shades of meaning. She had a way of seeing past the surface, of understanding the unspoken, the subtle currents that flowed beneath polite conversation. My father, in his world of rigid hierarchies and blunt pronouncements, of black and white certainties, had always found that unsettling, that ability to delve into the gray. He'd infantilized her intelligence, belittled her quiet strengths, those intellectual capacities he couldn't easily categorize or control, and now in his retelling, he was turning her into a punchline, a caricature to amuse his cronies. This time, though, something was different. The joke had landed, as usual, with a predictable ripple of polite chuckles from his fellow retired officers, men who'd known him forever and likely echoed his sentiments about women who thought too much, who possessed intellectual depths beyond their comprehension. But as my father leaned back in his leather armchair, a triumphant glint in his eye, a satisfied smugness settling on his features, I noticed a flicker of something else in the periphery of my vision, a barely perceptible shift in the demeanor of one of the guests, a man named Sterling, who'd always struck me as overly solicitous, overly eager to please my father, a man who seemed to orbit my father's ego like a loyal moon. Sterling, a man I'd always suspected knew far more than he let on, a man whose career seemed inexplicably intertwined with my father's rise through the ranks, a man who benefited from my father's good graces. He caught my eye, and for a fleeting second, there was a look there, not amusement, not deference, but something akin to grim recognition, a silent acknowledgement of something he too had witnessed. And then it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by his usual practiced smile, his mask firmly back in place. The memory of that look stayed with me, a persistent, almost intrusive thought. It was a tiny crack in the facade of my father's carefully constructed narrative, a chink in his armor of self-aggrandizement. My mother had always been more than a translator. She had been the quiet force behind him, the one who smoothed over his diplomatic rough edges, the one who understood the nuances he'd always dismissed as trivial or irrelevant. She had been the architect of his understanding, the one who provided the context he so desperately needed. My father, in his blind pursuit of advancement, had leveraged her intelligence, her insights, her very essence to climb his ladder, and then when she was no longer useful, when her quiet influence became inconvenient or simply unacknowledged, he'd reduced her to a joke, a footnote in his grand autobiography. The quiet revenge wasn't immediate. It was a seed that germinated slowly, patiently, in the fertile ground of my accumulated resentment, a resentment that had been building for years, nurtured by countless similar slights, each one a small chip away at my respect for him. I didn't confront him, of course. That would have been exactly what he expected, a predictable outburst he could easily dismiss as emotional overreaction, a sign of my inherent weakness. Instead, I started paying closer attention, adopting my mother's meticulous nature. I sifted through old family photos, not for smiling portraits designed for public consumption, but for the subtle glances, the unspoken interactions, the fleeting moments of connection or disconnect that hinted at a deeper reality. I revisited my mother's journals, her meticulous notes, her brilliant analyses of political situations that my father had effortlessly claimed credit for, her intellectual contributions systematically erased from the official record. I found it tucked away in a small leather-bound notebook, nestled between pressed flowers and faded train tickets, a code. My mother, ever the wordsmith, ever the one who found beauty and meaning in language, had devised a simple yet ingenious system. Each country, each significant diplomatic event, had a corresponding string of seemingly nonsensical letters, a mnemonic device that only she understood. It was her way of cataloging, of keeping her own private record, a testament to her vital, unacknowledged contributions, a secret history of her influence. And there it was, nestled amongst pages of elegant script, beside the entry for the very country my father so loved to joke about. Silver lining. A phrase that suggested hope, a positive outcome, a hidden benefit. Sterling, I discovered through a few discreet inquiries and a deep dive into archived military records, had been more than just a sycophantic colleague. He'd been a younger officer, assigned to my father's team during that particular mission, a protege of sorts, but also someone who had been privy to the inner workings of their operations, to the subtle machinations behind the scenes, to my mother's quiet but significant influence. He'd been a witness to her true role, a silent observer of the dynamic between my parents. The next time my father hosted one of his retrospective gatherings, the same cast of characters, the same predictable stories rehashing past glories, I was prepared. I'd spent weeks rehearsing the words, honing the delivery, making sure the calm, measured tone would carry the weight of my intentions. The translator joke was trotted out, met with the same hearty laughter, the familiar echo of manufactured camaraderie. My father, basking in the glow of his fabricated brilliance, was in his element, his chest puffed out, his voice booming with self-satisfaction. As he paused for effect, for the inevitable appreciative silence that followed his pronouncements, I leaned forward, my voice deliberately pitched to carry, but not so loud as to be disruptive, maintaining an air of respectful inquiry. "Father," I said, my tone calm, almost conversational, a gentle ripple in the otherwise boisterous waters. "You know, when you talk about that mission, I always remember Mother's little shorthand for it. Silver lining. Wasn't it?" The air in the room solidified. The laughter died with an audible collective gasp. My father blinked, his jovial expression faltering, a flicker of confusion clouding his usually confident features. Sterling, seated a few places down, went absolutely still, his fork hovering halfway to his mouth. His eyes, which had been fixed on my father, darted towards me, a mixture of alarm and something unreadable, a flash of recognition mixed with a hint of dread. And then it was gone, his gaze snapping back to his plate, his composure rapidly reasserting itself. "Silver lining?" my father repeated, a frown creasing his brow, the jovial tone replaced by a hint of irritation. "What are you talking about? It was just a difficult translator. A cultural mismatch." "No, father," I continued, my gaze unwavering, meeting his directly, a quiet challenge in my eyes. "Mother kept meticulous notes. She used a code for every significant assignment, a way of cataloging her contributions. And for that particular mission for that country, her code was silver lining. I found her journals. She documented everything. The subtle shifts in negotiation, the cultural nuances you missed, the way she quietly guided the conversations, the unspoken understandings she fostered. The translator was instrumental, wasn't she? She was the one who saw the real value, the real outcome, the true silver lining of the whole operation. The silence that followed was absolute, a palpable thing that pressed in on us all. My father's face, usually so ruddy and animated, had gone pale, a stark contrast to his usual robust complexion. He looked caught, exposed. Sterling, meanwhile, had subtly pushed his chair back, his expression a mask of carefully cultivated disinterest, but his knuckles were white where he gripped the edge of the table, a physical manifestation of his inner turmoil. The other officers, men who had always seen my father as an unassailable force, a titan of industry and military prowess, exchanged uncertain glances, their usual bravado replaced by a dawning unease. They were not used to hearing this narrative, this quiet but devastating challenge to the established order, this revelation of a hidden history. My father attempted a bluster, a desperate attempt to regain control of the narrative. "That is preposterous. Your mother was a charming woman, of course, a lovely hostess, but hardly involved in the strategic decisions of a high-level diplomatic mission. Wasn't she?" I asked, my voice still quiet, still even devoid of any outward emotion, yet carrying an immense weight of truth. "Her translation was a masterpiece of strategic communication," wouldn't you say? The silver lining of the whole operation was her understanding of human connection, of the subtle dynamics of interpersonal relationships, something you always seem to find inconvenient or perhaps beneath your notice. The room was suffocating, the air thick with unspoken accusations and the palpable discomfort of those present. My father's ego had been pricked, not with a sharp sword, but with the dull point of indisputable truth, a slow, persistent abrasion that he couldn't ignore or deflect. He couldn't argue with the journals, with the code, with the undeniable fact that my mother had been more than he'd ever acknowledged, more than he'd ever allowed her to be. Sterling, I noticed, was now avoiding all eye contact, his gaze fixed on some indeterminate point on the rug, a bead of sweat tracing a slow, deliberate path down his temple, a tiny rivulet of perspiration that spoke volumes. He was caught in the crossfire, his comfortable complicity disrupted, his carefully maintained facade beginning to crack. The gathering dissolved soon after, a hurried and awkward affair. The usual lingering conversations, the backslapping camaraderie, the relaxed atmosphere that typically characterized these events, were conspicuously absent. People made excuses, their departure hurried and awkward, a collective desire to escape the charged atmosphere. My father sat alone at the table, the teacup he'd once held with such authority now looking forlorn, a symbol of his diminished stature. The consequences weren't loud or dramatic, no public spectacle, no explosive confrontation. There were no headlines, no public shaming, just a subtle but profound shift in the social dynamics. But in the hushed corridors of his social circle, whispers began, carried on the winds of gossip and speculation. The esteemed Admiral, the man of action, the brilliant strategist, had apparently relied heavily on his wife's intellect, a fact he'd spent years obscuring, a truth he had actively worked to suppress. The translator joke started to sound hollow, pathetic even, an empty echo of a manufactured triumph. Men who had once hung on his every word now offered polite, distant smiles, their former deference tinged with a newfound skepticism. Sterling, the man who had been so eager to maintain the status quo, to benefit from my father's carefully crafted image, suddenly found himself out of favor, his own career stalling as if by some unseen force, the invisible hand of my father's displeasure now firmly upon him. My father and I stopped speaking for a while. Not in anger, not with the fiery passion of a true rift, but in a sort of stilted politeness that was far worse, a strained formality that spoke of an unbridgeable chasm. He knew I had the proof. He knew the comfortable narrative he'd built, the edifice of his life's achievements, was now riddled with holes, all thanks to the quiet diligence and intellectual brilliance of his translator. He couldn't erase it. He couldn't dismiss it as mere fantasy. He could only sit with the uncomfortable silence, the quiet humiliation of a truth he had tried to bury for years, finally unearthed and brought into the harsh light of day. The jokes stopped. The stories changed, the familiar anecdotes replaced by more guarded pronouncements. And the silence, for me, finally began to feel a little more peaceful, a quiet space where my mother's true legacy could finally breathe.